Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The cruelty to being ambushed in the one place you are supposed to be safe. Most people do not die in their wars or their adventures. They die in the familiar, the everyday, the unremarkable. Timothy Bradburn, 68 years old, died in his own doorway, in the home he shared with his daughter in northwest Spokane, Washington, on the night of June 25, 2024. He had just returned from a vacation in Hawaii. His suitcase was in his hand. His keys were in his fingers. He had barely crossed the threshold of the front door. He never got further than that. What happened to Timothy Bradburn is a story that does not fit neatly into any of the frameworks people usually use to make sense of violent crime. It is not the story of a stranger arriving in the night. It is not a robbery gone wrong or an act of mistaken identity. It is something more intimate and more disturbing. The story of a man killed by someone who had shared his table, lived under his roof, and had known his face since childhood. It is the story of a daughter who had been planning the act for weeks, who had practiced for it, written about it, and who, when the moment finally came, felt no urgent impulse to run or hide. Instead, she called the police herself. She sat down on the front porch and waited. And when they arrived, she handed them the notebook in which she had written everything. The life of the Bradburn household in Spokane, a city of gray winters and wide, quiet streets in the eastern reaches of Washington state, far removed from the gleaming coastal cities that most people associate with the Pacific Northwest. Spokane is a city where families settle in for the long haul, where neighborhoods have a stubborn, unpretentious permanence to them, where the rhythms of daily life do not tend toward drama. Timothy Bradburn was, by the modest measures of such a place, a man who had built a life around the simple pillars of home and family. He had a son named Trace, a daughter named Alyssa, and a house in the northwestern part of the city where, in the summer of 2024, he still lived alongside his daughter. He was 68 years old. He had traveled to Hawaii, one of those late-in-life trips that feel like a reward for decades of ordinary endurance, and had not yet unpacked his bags when his life ended. Alyssa Bradburn was 33 years old in the summer of 2024, an adult daughter living in her father's home, an arrangement that, on its surface, might have appeared unremarkable. Plenty of adult children live with parents out of necessity, out of affection, out of the grinding economics of modern life. But inside that house in northwest Spokane, something had been building in Alyssa Bradburn's mind for a long time. Something she had been keeping in the pages of a journal, something she had been rehearsing in the grip of a firearm, something she had been shaping, in private, into a plan. What that plan was, and what she believed justified it, would only become clear in the agonizing weeks that followed. The night of June 25, 2024, arrived without ceremony. Timothy Bradburn had taken an Uber from the airport back to the house on the quiet northwest side of the city, the way returning travelers do when they want the ease of a familiar route home. It was late, approaching midnight, and the Spokane streets would have been nearly empty, the city folded in on itself in the way it does after dark in summer, the air still warm but the light long gone. His vacation bags were packed. He had been away. He was coming home. He did not know that inside the house, his daughter had been waiting for him. Alyssa Bradburn had begun thinking about killing her father approximately 3 weeks before that night. 3 weeks is not a long time in the arc of a human life, but it is an eternity in the moral calculus of premeditation. During those 3 weeks, she had not simply thought about the act in the abstract. She had gone to a local gun range. She had asked for help loading the firearm she intended to use. She had practiced. She had made herself competent with a weapon for the specific purpose of using it on a specific person. And then, in the 4 days immediately before her father returned from Hawaii, she had begun writing in her journal, putting her intentions, her feelings, and her plans into words, one entry at a time. She wrote that she intended to shoot him. She wrote about how she would do it. She wrote about what would happen after. The journal was not the impulsive outpouring of a person in crisis. It read, by all accounts, as a deliberate account of a deliberate plan. And when that plan reached its conclusion on the night of June 25th, she did not destroy the journal or hide it or dispose of it in any of the ways that a person trying to avoid consequences might. She kept it. She handed it to the police when they arrived. "My journal has my confession and everything in it," she told officers when they reached the scene. The moment itself was not witnessed by anyone but Alyssa. The street outside was quiet. The house was dark. Timothy Bradburn stepped through his own front door, still carrying his suitcase, still holding his keys. The posture of a man arriving home, not a man preparing for danger, and his daughter opened fire. She had shot him 3 times, twice in the chest, once in the head. The final shot to the head, she explained, was to make sure he was dead. Timothy Bradburn died in his own entryway. What happened next was one of the most unusual sequences of events in the entire case, and in some ways the most unsettling. Alyssa Bradburn did not flee. She did not panic. She walked out of the house, sat down on the front porch, and called 911. When the dispatcher answered, she reported the shooting with a directness that defied everything one might expect from the immediate aftermath of violence. She told the dispatcher that she had shot her father. She told them where his body was, in the entryway of the home. She said she would be waiting outside for officers to arrive. And then she did exactly that. She sat there, calm and present, until the police pulled up. When the officers arrived and took her into custody, she handed them the journal. The investigation that followed did not require the kind of painstaking reconstruction that most homicide cases demand. There was no mystery about who had pulled the trigger. There was no question about where or when the killing had taken place. The puzzle that investigators, prosecutors, and eventually a jury would spend months examining was not the what, but the why, and whether whatever reason Alyssa Bradburn had in her mind could, in the eyes of the law, change the nature of what she had done. In the days immediately following the shooting, Alyssa Bradburn offered a reason. She told police that her father had been abusive, that he had beaten her and her dogs, that he had shot her dogs with a BB gun in the backyard, that he had, when she was a child, committed acts against her so serious that, if true, would have explained the deepest kind of despair. These were accusations of profound suffering. If true, they would have painted a picture of a woman who had endured years of torment in silence, who had finally reached a breaking point she could no longer contain. But the accusations did not hold. Investigators searched for any corroborating evidence, police reports, hospital records, court filings, testimony from those who knew the household. Spokane County court records found no legal history involving Timothy Bradburn, no prior reports of abuse, no documentation of any kind that supported what Alyssa was alleging. A Spokane Police Department representative, citing the ongoing investigation at the time, declined to comment on the accusations. And then, as the legal process ground forward and the months passed, something extraordinary happened. Alyssa Bradburn withdrew the allegations entirely. She stopped claiming self-defense. She stopped claiming abuse. And in a moment that reverberated through the courtroom when it finally came, she said something that most defendants, guilty or innocent, never say. "It's the result," she told investigators. "I killed someone, so you go to jail for that. He wasn't trying to kill me at the time." It was, in its way, a confession more complete and more disturbing than most prosecutors ever receive. Not only had she committed the act, and not only had she planned it, but she had acknowledged, openly and without apparent remorse, that her father was not a threat to her in the moment she killed him. Whatever her reasons, whatever dark logic had been building in the pages of that journal for 3 weeks, it had not been a matter of immediate danger. She had not fired in a moment of terror. She had waited. She had practiced. She had chosen a moment when he would be at his most vulnerable and his most unsuspecting, and she had executed a plan she had been rehearsing in her mind for weeks. Throughout the legal proceedings, Alyssa Bradburn's behavior continued to unsettle and confound all those who observed it. She was described by those present in the courtroom as someone who sat with an unusual stillness, not the rigid, frightened stillness of a person overwhelmed by the weight of a murder charge, but something harder to define. She was observed smiling on multiple occasions. During the trial itself, She stood and addressed the court, and the words she chose were blunt in a way that few had ever heard from a defendant on trial for the life of a parent. "I killed Tim Bradburn," she said, "and I am guilty." Then she added, with the composed certainty of someone who had long since made her peace with the outcome, "I'm not afraid anymore. I'm okay with going to prison for however long." The smile that accompanied these words did not go unnoticed by the jury, by the observers in the gallery, or by the journalists who filed their dispatches from the courtroom. It was the kind of smile that invites 1,000 interpretations and satisfies none of them. Was it the release of someone who had been carrying a secret for too long? Was it the flat effect of mental illness, a face unable to produce the expressions that the moment demanded? Or was it something else entirely, some inner resolution so complete that even the most solemn legal proceeding could not disturb it? Her defense team argued during sentencing that she suffered from a severe mental illness, specifically a condition that caused her to blur the boundaries between fantasy and reality. Ms. Bradburn suffers from a state where she sometimes blurs fantasy with reality, her defense attorney, Brian Raymond, told the court, arguing for a sentence of 25 years. The prosecution pushed back with equal force. Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Emily Sullivan stood before the court and made the case that whatever was going on inside Alyssa Bradburn's mind, the evidence told a story of calculated, methodical, entirely real preparation for a murder. The evidence that was presented during this trial demonstrated an extreme and elaborate degree of planning, Sullivan said. The gun range, the practice loading, the 3 weeks of intent, the 4 days of journaling, the waiting, the suitcase in his hand. There was someone else in the courtroom that day who had not had any say in any of it. Trace Bradburn, Alyssa's brother, Timothy's son, sat in the gallery and waited for his turn to speak. He had lost his father on a Tuesday night in June when his father walked through a door carrying a suitcase full of Hawaiian sunlight. He had also, in the surreal arithmetic of the criminal justice system, lost his sister, for 28 years at least. The no-contact order issued by the court ensured that these 2 surviving members of the Bradburn family would be legally prohibited from communicating with each other. 2 griefs running side by side, cut off from one another by judicial decree. When Trace Bradburn stood before the court and addressed the judge, he did not shout. He did not demand that his sister be given the maximum sentence, or express the kind of public rage that observers might have expected from a son who had watched his father's killer smile in a courtroom. He spoke instead with the quiet devastation of a man trying to explain what it feels like to have a hole opened in the center of a life. "I just have to live my life with that," he said, "and it just gets me every day." Those 11 words, simple, unadorned, requiring no legal vocabulary or dramatic flourish to communicate their full weight, were perhaps the most powerful spoken in the entire proceedings. They were the words of someone not performing grief, not staging sorrow for a camera or a jury, but simply reporting the truth of what it is to be left behind. On April 2nd, 2026, nearly 2 years after the night Timothy Bradburn came home from Hawaii and never unpacked his bag, Judge Julie McKay of Spokane County Superior Court delivered her sentence. The state had argued for 31 years and 7 months, citing the deliberate and premeditated nature of the crime, its calculation, its cruelty, and the complete absence of any prior criminal history that might have served as warning. The defense had asked for 25 years, leaning on the argument of mental illness, of a mind that had perhaps lost its footing between the real and the imagined. McKay, as judges sometimes do when faced with 2 irreconcilable poles of argument, found her own ground. She imposed 280 months for the first-degree murder conviction and added a mandatory 60-month firearm enhancement on top of that, bringing the total to 340 months, 28 years and 4 months in prison. She also ordered 36 months of community custody upon release, and issued the lifetime no-contact order that now legally separates Alyssa Bradburn from her brother Trace forever. Unfortunately, the crime Ms. Bradburn decided to start her criminal history with is the most significant and serious that we have, Judge McKay said from the bench, in a sentence that contained its own particular kind of sorrow. The recognition that a person who had, before June 25, 2024, never once been in trouble with the law had chosen, as her first act of lawbreaking, to end a human life. Alyssa Bradburn did not deliver an allocution. She had, perhaps, already said everything she was going to say. She had said it with a smile. She had said it in a notebook. She had said it to a 911 dispatcher in the middle of the night, waiting on a porch while her father lay dead in the entryway. She had said she was not afraid. She had said she was ready. Timothy Bradburn had been 68 years old. He had a son who would spend the rest of his life living with a grief that, by his own description, guts him every day. He had gone to Hawaii and come home to die. He had carried his suitcase through the front door of a house that had, without his knowledge, been quietly transformed over the preceding 3 weeks into a place of calculated danger. He had been shot 4 times in the place that every person on earth is supposed to be safest, the threshold of their own home. The journal his daughter handed to the police that night has been entered into the permanent record of one of the more disturbing and confounding criminal cases in Spokane's recent history. In its pages, written calmly over 4 days, is the account of a plan that was carried out exactly as described. Whatever was in Alyssa Bradburn's mind as she wrote those entries, whatever version of reality she was inhabiting, whatever logic governed the decisions she was committing to paper, the act itself was real, the gun was real, and the man who came home from a holiday and walked through his own front door was real in every sense that matters. He did not survive to tell his side of the story. He never had the chance. That is the weight that no sentence, however long, and no courtroom proceeding, however thorough, can fully address. A man is gone. A family is shattered beyond repair. A brother grieves in legally mandated silence. And in a northwest Spokane neighborhood that most people drive through without a second thought, there is a doorway that stands as the quiet, terrible center of a story no one in that house was supposed to live. Story 2. There are towns in Louisiana where the Spanish moss hangs so thick from the cypress trees that the light seems to arrive already exhausted, filtered down through a silver curtain of green and gray. Mandeville is one such place, a quiet, sun-drenched community nestled along the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, a world away from the chaos of New Orleans, yet close enough to see its skyline shimmer on clear days across the water. The streets of Mandeville are lined with live oaks, the air carries the faint smell of the lake, and neighbors tend to know each other's names. It is, by all accounts, the kind of place where people plant gardens and raise children and believe, perhaps more than is always wise, in second chances. It was in this town that Julie Morange grew up, a girl whose warmth seemed to radiate outward naturally, like heat from sun-baked brick. Those who knew Julie as a child described her as someone who made every room feel a little kinder, a little softer. She was spirited and compassionate in equal measure, the kind of friend who remembered birthdays and who showed up when things got hard. As she grew older, those qualities deepened rather than faded. They drew her toward a career built on care. She would eventually become the director of marketing for a hospice in New Orleans, a role that required both a sharp professional mind and an extraordinary capacity for empathy. She helped families navigate the most painful thresholds of their lives, and she did it with grace. But long before any of that, long before the career and the city commute and the title on her business card, Julie had known a boy named George. Their families had been close for years, woven together in the way that families in small southern towns often are, through shared dinners, shared history, and the long threads of friendship that run quietly between households. George's sister was Julie's best friend growing up. They had been children together, teenagers together. They had watched each other become adults from a comfortable, familiar distance. When they reconnected as grown-ups, there must have been something deeply comforting about it. The way reuniting with someone from your childhood carries its own particular warmth, like finding a book you loved as a child and discovering it still holds its magic. They fell in love, or at least something that resembled love. In October 2014, they married. Julie had always dreamed of being a mother. It was a longing she carried openly, without apology. When she married George, he came with children from a previous relationship, and Julie embraced them completely, stepping into the role of stepmother with the same wholehearted dedication she brought to everything else in her life. For a while, the life she had built seemed to be exactly what she had imagined. A home in Mandeville, a family around her, a husband she had known half her life. But there is a version of a person that exists in private, away from the light of other people's perception, that is sometimes unrecognizable from the one everyone thinks they know. George Dargas had a shadow life, one that predated his marriage to Julie by nearly 2 decades. Between 1996 and 2014, he had accumulated a long and troubling criminal record. Convictions for burglary, theft, and possession of narcotics. He had spent time in prison. He had been given chances, and he had misused them. Whether Julie knew the full extent of this history when they married is uncertain, but she would come to understand it in the years that followed, piece by painful piece. The marriage began to fracture when Julie discovered that George had returned to using narcotics. It is impossible to know precisely what that moment of discovery felt like, the collision of love and betrayal, the ground shifting beneath something she had built her hope upon. But she did what she had to do. She separated from him. They began living apart, and Julie, who had always moved toward difficult things with courage, tried to find her way to a new chapter. George did not make it easy. In the final days of November 2017, the tension that had been building for months spilled into the open in a way that should have served as a warning. On November 28th, for days before everything would come apart completely, George was pulled over by a police officer for speeding. Rather than stop, he fled, pressing the accelerator down and racing away from the flashing lights behind him. He eventually crashed his car and attempted to run on foot. Officers tracked him down, and when they searched the vehicle, they found a vial of codeine. He was charged with reckless operation of a motor vehicle, aggravated flight from an officer, and possession of a controlled substance. And then, with a casualness that in hindsight seems almost incomprehensible, he was released on bond. Just a few days later, he was back on the streets of Mandeville, a man with a history of crime, a drug problem, a fractured marriage, and apparently very little left to lose. The morning of December 2nd, 2017 began the way most mornings do in Mandeville, quietly. The lake mist had not yet lifted. The town was only beginning to stir. Julie was at home, the home she and George had once shared, the home that was now supposed to be hers alone. No one knows exactly when George arrived, or what he told himself as he drove there. Perhaps he came with the intention of talking, of repairing what had broken. Perhaps something darker had already settled into the space where reason should have been. Whatever his intentions, the conversation turned into an argument. What happened next belongs to the most agonizing category of human tragedy. Violence visited upon someone by the very person who once promised to protect them. George attacked Julie with savage force. He stabbed her multiple times in the abdomen. He slashed her throat. He struck her in the head and face with blunt force. The kitchen, which had once been the center of an ordinary family home, became the scene of something terrible and final. When police would later arrive, they would describe what they found in language stripped bare by professional necessity, but even their clinical words could not fully contain the horror of it. Julie Morange Dargas, 37 years old, was found face down on the kitchen floor. She had not survived. George fled. He took her rental car, the car that was supposed to carry her through her new life, the one she had while her own was out of commission, and he drove away from the home, away from what he had done, and out into the early morning along Highway 190. What followed was a crime spree so erratic, so devoid of logic, that it reads almost like the behavior of a man in freefall, spiraling outward from the center of an unthinkable act. In quick succession, while the town was still waking up, the police began receiving calls. A robbery at Eddie's Grocery on Highway 190 in Lacombe. A burglary at Lishman's City Market. A break-in at the Lacombe Car Washington. An attempted unauthorized entry at a Dollar General. In case after case, the method was the same. A car driven directly into the storefront to create an opening. Julie's rental car, used as a battering ram, smashing through the glass and wood of small businesses along the highway as dawn broke over St. Tammany Parish. It was as though George was leaving a trail not of breadcrumbs, but of wreckage, a path of destruction that mapped the geography of his collapse. Meanwhile, investigators had not yet connected the dots. The burglaries were being investigated as their own incidents. Julie was still lying on her kitchen floor. Her rental car was still out in the morning, its driver hurtling toward whatever came next. What came next was both terrible and, in a strange way, the beginning of the end. At around 7:30 in the morning, the phone rang at the home of George's parents in Slidell, just across the water on the other side of the twin-span bridge. George had shown up at their door with blood on his clothes. He told them he had hurt his wife. It is difficult to fully imagine what that moment must have been like for his parents. The arrival of their son, blood-stained at their threshold, confessing something monstrous with perhaps just enough detachment to make it worse. Whatever they felt, they did not protect him. They told him to leave. And then they called the police. That call set everything in motion. Officers traced it back to Julie, and when they arrived at her Mandeville home, they found her as George had left her, brutally murdered, the kitchen bearing witness to a violence that no ordinary morning should ever have to hold. At the same time, law enforcement began searching for George, connecting the description of the rental car being used in the string of burglaries to the missing vehicle from Julie's address. He did not make it far. On the twin-span bridge between Slidell and New Orleans, a long, low stretch of concrete suspended over Lake Pontchartrain, the kind of road that feels like it belongs between two worlds, George Dargas wrecked the rental car. He was apprehended there, on that bridge, with nowhere left to go and nowhere left to hide. The car that had belonged to Julie, the one he had taken from her home after taking her life, came to rest on the concrete above the dark water, and with it, so did George's flight from consequence. He was arrested. The long machinery of justice began to turn. In March of 2018, a St. Tammany Parish grand jury handed down a formal indictment. The charges were numerous and detailed, reflecting not just the murder but the full arc of destruction George had carved through that December morning. Second-degree murder, possession of controlled dangerous substance, aggravated flight from an officer, aggravated obstruction of a highway, unauthorized entry of a business, multiple counts of simple criminal damage to property, 2 counts of simple burglary, and simple robbery. Each charge was a chapter in a story that should never have been written. The investigation had been thorough. The St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office had gathered the evidence, connected the timeline, and built a case that left George Dargas with very little room to maneuver. In April of 2019, nearly a year and a half after Julie's death, George sat in a courtroom in Covington and pleaded guilty to every single charge in the indictment. He did not contest a single count. The sentencing was presided over by District Judge Reginald Badeau. For the second-degree murder of his wife, George received the mandatory sentence under Louisiana law, life in prison without the possibility of parole, probation, or suspension of sentence. For the remaining charges, he received an additional cumulative total of 70 years, to be served concurrently. He would not see freedom again, but the numbers, the years, the legal language, none of it could fully capture what had been lost. That task fell to the people who had loved Julie. The victim's family filled one side of the courtroom. They had come from their grief to bear witness, to stand in that room and let the court hear what her absence had done to them. Among them was Cindy Morange, Julie's mother, a woman who had watched her daughter grow from a compassionate girl into a remarkable woman, only to have that life ended in the most brutal way imaginable. When she rose to speak, her words did not reach for eloquence. They reached for truth. "You lied and said you loved Julie," Cindy said, her voice carrying across the courtroom to the man who sat accused of her daughter's murder. "You don't murder people you love. Our lives are forever changed. Our lives will never be the same. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to the families of murder victims, one that is not simply the grief of loss but the grief of violation, of having something precious and irreplaceable torn away not by accident or illness, but by deliberate human cruelty." Cindy Morange's words held all of that. They held 37 years of a daughter's life. They held every birthday that would not come, every morning that would not arrive, every future that had been severed in a kitchen in Mandeville on a December day. They held the weight of a mother's love meeting the incomprehensible fact of its object's destruction. Julie Morange Dargas was, by every account, a woman who gave more than she took. She spent her working days helping families through loss. She opened her home and her heart to children who were not biologically hers. She forgave and tried again and believed in the people she loved. She was, in the truest sense, someone who made the world around her better. The case that bears her name is not just a record of a crime. It is a testimony to the kind of person whose absence leaves an irreplaceable hollow in the lives of everyone who knew her. The broader story of her case was eventually brought to a wider audience when Investigation Discovery featured it on their documentary series American Monster, in an episode titled Ghost from the Past. The title, perhaps, captures something true about the nature of what happened. A ghost from Julie's past returned, not to haunt her gently, but to destroy her. George David Dargas Jr. is currently serving his life sentence at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, one of the oldest and most storied prisons in America, a place from which no parole will come, no early release, no second chapter. He will grow old there. The twin-span bridge where he was caught still stretches over Lake Pontchartrain, carrying traffic between Slidell and New Orleans every day. The highway businesses along Route 190 have long since repaired their broken windows and shattered walls. Mandeville has continued its quiet rhythm of lake breezes and oak-lined streets. But somewhere in that town, and in the hearts of those who loved her, the absence of Julie Morange Dargas is a wound that time has not closed. Her mother's words remain the most honest epitaph. Lives forever changed, forever not the same, because in Mandeville, on a morning in December, a woman who had given so much of herself to caring for others was given no one to protect her from the ghost who came home. Story 3. The night of February 26, 2019, was cold in Evansville, Indiana. The kind of cold that settles into the bones and makes a person long for the warmth of home. For Robert "Robbie" Dorr, home was precisely where he was headed. After a grueling 12-hour shift at the Evansville Fire Department, the 51-year-old firefighter had earned every minute of the rest that awaited him. He had no reason to believe that the short walk from his car to his front door would be the last steps he ever took. He had no way of knowing that someone was already waiting for him in the shadows of his own driveway. Robbie Dorr was, by every account, the kind of man a community builds itself around. He had given 28 years of his life to the Evansville Fire Department, not out of obligation, but out of love for the city and the people in it. He could to make someone happy. Robbie was also the kind of man who worked through his days off, taking on extra shifts at a local fast food restaurant. Not because he had to, but because he believed in the dignity of hard work and the warmth of earning his keep. It was at that restaurant that he met a woman named Elizabeth Fox, known to everyone as Becky. They spent 11 years as friends before something shifted between them, before friendship deepened into love, and before Robbie decided she was the one he wanted to walk through life with. They married in Panama City, Florida, and for a while, by all appearances, they were happy. Becky Fox Dorr was a woman with a complicated history. This was her 6th marriage, a fact that might have given some pause, but Robbie was not a man inclined toward judgment. His daughter, Lindsay Griffin, later recalled that her father seemed genuinely happy in the early days of their marriage. But happiness, it turned out, was fragile. He started to feel insecure, Lindsay would say. He started to think she was cheating on him. Robbie was not a man who aired his fears loudly. Instead, he did what many people do when they sense the ground shifting beneath their feet. He watched. He paid attention, and he sat down and wrote his wife a letter. In that letter, he laid bare his suspicions in plain, heartbroken language. "Ever since he came back into your life," he wrote. "I see his text on your phone." The letter was a window into a marriage quietly fracturing, a man quietly drowning in doubt. He had no name in the letter, only the pronoun that pointed, unmistakably, toward a presence that had worked its way between him and his wife. That presence had a name, Larry Richmond Sr. Larry Richmond Sr. had entered the lives of the Dorr family through the most ordinary of channels. He was the fiancé of Becky's younger sister, Amanda Fillmore, known to family as Mandy. By all surface appearances, he was charming, good-looking, easy with a smile, the kind of person who made others feel at ease. The two couples had even socialized together, going on double dates, weaving themselves into each other's lives with the casual intimacy of family. But Larry Richmond Sr. had a history that no charm could entirely conceal. In 1996, when he was only 17 years old, he had shot and killed a 70-year-old man. The crime had cost him more than 2 decades of his life, spent behind prison walls. He had been released just a year before, carrying with him the quiet devastation of a man who had lost 22 years and was now attempting to reconstruct something in their place. Mandy believed he was a changed man. She believed in him with the whole of her heart. She would later learn what her faith had missed. The evening of February 26th unfolded with terrible precision. Robbie had picked up an additional shift, a gesture so typical of him that no one would have thought twice about it. When he finally came home, Exhausted and ready for rest, his wife was inside the house, ostensibly cooking dinner. According to prosecutors, while Robbie was still on his way home, Becky made a 4-minute phone call. A call that, within minutes, would set the final act of a conspiracy in motion. She then deleted the call from her phone, sweeping it from the record as thoroughly as one might sweep crumbs from a counter. Larry Richmond Sr. was already positioned near the house, waiting. He had been checking police scanner applications on his phone that night. He had been monitoring Robbie's social media. He was, in every meaningful sense, a predator tracking his quarry's movements. And then Robbie pulled into his driveway. What happened next was over in seconds. Larry Richmond Sr. opened fire. Robbie Dorr, who had spent 28 years running toward danger to protect strangers, had no chance to run anywhere at all. He was shot 3 times. He fell. By the time Becky called 911, her husband was already dying on the pavement of their driveway, the same concrete he had walked across thousands of times. The firefighters who responded to the scene knew the moment they arrived who was lying there. They had worked beside this man for years. They had trusted him with their lives. The last image they got is Robbie, laying there dead on the sidewalk. The investigation that followed was painstaking and, in its early stages, frustratingly incomplete. Detectives from the Evansville Police Department understood instinctively that the answers they needed were somewhere close. In the phones, in the relationships, in the small details that lie beneath the surface of any domestic tragedy. They began with Becky's phone. The initial search turned up nothing suspicious, but investigators were not satisfied. They obtained the raw extraction data directly from her cell phone carrier, and what they found there changed everything. Buried in that data, in the digital graveyard of deleted records, was the evidence of a call placed to a contact listed in Becky's phone as Larry Ollie. The call had been made just 15 minutes before Robbie was shot and killed. It had been deliberately erased. When Detective Jeff Hands of the Evansville Police Department sat across from Becky and pressed her about the call, she denied any knowledge of it. For an hour and a half, she held that position, the position of a grieving widow, blindsided and innocent. But after 90 minutes of patient, methodical questioning, something in her gave way. She admitted that Larry Richmond Sr. had called her. Their conversation, she insisted, had been entirely innocent. Something to do with outdoor lights, a mundane domestic topic that had nothing whatsoever to do with the husband bleeding out in her driveway. She denied the affair. She denied any foreknowledge of murder. She denied everything. She was charged with obstruction of justice and false informing. Then, 7 months later, those charges were quietly dropped. For the Dorr family, the dismissal felt like a door slamming in their faces. Robbie had been dead less than a year, and the person they believed had helped orchestrate his death was walking free. The case seemed to be going cold before it had ever truly caught fire. But the investigators were not done. The trail leading to Larry Richmond Sr. was growing more substantial with every passing month. A critical piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected direction: the murder weapon. Forensic examination revealed that Robbie had been struck by 2 different types of projectiles, a detail that pointed investigators toward a very specific kind of firearm. The Taurus Judge, a distinctive weapon capable of firing both shotgun shells and pistol ammunition. A Taurus Judge had been reported stolen from a local pawn shop. That pawn shop happened to be where Richmond Sr.'s son, Larry Richmond Jr., was employed at the time the weapon went missing. When investigators brought the father and son in for questioning, the session with Larry Richmond Jr. proved to be a turning point. He told investigators he knew nothing about the murder, but then, in the same breath, he admitted he had stolen the gun from his workplace. He also revealed something even more damning: that his father had buried guns in the backyard of Mandy Fillmore's home. Police arrived at Fillmore's property with shovels and warrants. They dug up the backyard and recovered multiple firearms, all of them with their serial numbers scratched away. An act that speaks not to careless storage but to deliberate concealment, the behavior of a man who understood the incriminating weight of what he was hiding. The murder weapon itself was not among them, but the guns that were recovered painted a portrait of a man comfortable with violence and practiced in the art of hiding it. Then came the detail that, in retrospect, felt almost like audacity. At Robbie's own funeral, the gathering where his family and friends came together in grief to say their final goodbyes, Richmond Sr. had slipped a note into a condolence card. Robbie's stepson, Nathaniel Guthrie, discovered it while sorting through the cards sent to the family. The message was brief and chilling in its implications. "We need to talk." Below those 4 words was a phone number and the name Larry at the bottom. It was not the message of a man consumed by grief or guilt. It was the message of a man managing loose ends. Becky said she knew nothing about the note, but its very existence, tucked inside a card meant to offer comfort to a murdered man's family, was a detail that investigators and jurors alike would not forget. In February 2020, the Evansville Police Department officially named Larry Richmond Sr. as a person of interest. A search warrant was issued for his cell phone data, and what that data revealed was devastating. It placed him geographically near the scene of Robbie's murder. It showed him checking police scanner apps that evening, as though monitoring the response to the crime he had just committed. It showed him looking at Robbie Doerr's social media, a detail that, taken alone, means little, but in the full context of the evidence, felt like a final, terrible piece clicking into place. The investigation moved slowly, with the care and deliberateness that a case of this complexity demanded. 3.5 years after Robbie's murder, in August 2022, the Vanderburgh County Prosecutor's Office finally filed murder charges against both Larry Richmond Sr. and Elizabeth Fox Doerr. Prosecutors alleged that the motive was financial, that Richmond and Becky had conspired to secure Robbie's pension, trading a man's life for the steady income that would follow his death. Both defendants pleaded not guilty. Becky's trial began on May 6, 2024, more than 5 years after Robbie was killed. The courtroom filled with the weight of everything that had been building since that February night in 2019. Prosecutor Diana Mowers Davis laid out the prosecution's case with precision. Becky had been in the kitchen when Richmond Sr. ambushed her husband. She had made the 4-minute call. The call that prosecutors argued was the signal, the green light, the moment the plan became irreversible. She had then deleted it, not because she routinely cleared her phone as her defense claimed, but because she understood what that call meant. Defense attorney Mark Phillips pushed back with equal force. He argued there was no physical evidence tying Becky to the planning of the murder. No gun, no written instructions, no witness who had heard her ask anyone to harm Robbie. The phone call, he said, was not a murder plot. It was a phone call. The jury listened. They weighed the testimony of Richmond Jr., who had described stealing the tourist judge and giving it to his father. They heard from witnesses at the Evansville Fire Department who testified about the pension, about conversations, about money, about the financial logic of a dead husband versus a living one. After 6 days of evidence and hours of deliberation, they came back with their verdict: guilty. Guilty of murder. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. At her sentencing hearing on July 17, 2024, Becky Fox Doerr stood before the court and spoke her final words on the matter. "I am innocent of these crimes," she said. "I never asked anyone to harm or murder my husband." The judge sentenced her to 90 years in prison. She was 52 years old. The sentence meant she would almost certainly die behind bars. But the case was not yet complete. Larry Richmond Sr., the man who had actually pulled the trigger, the man whose hands had ended Robbie Doerr's life, still had his own reckoning to face. His trial finally began in December 2025. The prosecution presented the same devastating architecture of evidence. The location data, the scanner apps, the stolen gun, the buried weapons, the note at the funeral. After 3 days of trial and a late-night deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. On February 13, 2026, nearly 7 years to the month after Robbie Doerr was shot down in his own driveway, a judge sentenced Larry Richmond Sr. to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free again. The man who had already taken 22 years from himself in a prior murder conviction had now surrendered every remaining year of his life to the consequences of a second killing. Prosecutor Diana Mowers, who had carried this case through years of investigation and 2 separate trials, released a statement that captured the exhaustion and the relief of a long ordeal finally at its end. "This signifies the ultimate verdict for justice and the conclusion of a long ordeal for this community, as well as the family and friends of Doerr," she said. She acknowledged the extraordinary collaboration of agencies that had made it possible. The Evansville Police Department, the Evansville Fire Department, the Indiana State Police, the FBI, and the cell phone forensics lab within the Vanderburgh County Prosecutor's Office. It had taken all of them, working across years, to reconstruct the truth from the fragments that two people had tried so hard to bury. For Robbie's daughter, Lindsay Griffin, the verdicts offered something, though not everything. She had stood before the sentencing court and delivered a statement that cut through all the legal language and procedural formality to the human wound at the center of the case. Her father had loved Becky so much, she said, that he sacrificed his relationship with me. He had bent himself around the demands of that marriage, had given it the best of himself, and had lost his life for it. Now his grandson would grow up having never met him. Now the sound of his voice, the warm, particular sound of Robbie Dorr laughing, calling out a hello, saying I love you, was fading with the years. After 5 years, Lindsay said quietly, trying to remember the sound of the voice gets harder and harder each year. That is the weight that justice cannot lift. It can put killers in prison. It can name the conspiracy, trace the deleted call, find the buried guns, and follow the location data to its grim conclusion. But it cannot give back the 28 years of selfless service that Robbie Dorr gave to Evansville before someone decided his life was worth less than a pension check. It cannot return a father to his daughter, or a grandfather to a child who never knew his face. What it can do, what it finally did after 7 long years, is look at what was done to Robbie Dorr and say, plainly and without equivocation, this was wrong, and we see it, and it will not go unanswered. Robbie Dorr spent his career running into burning buildings so that others could walk out. He died on the pavement of his own home, not in the line of a fire, but in the crossfire of betrayal. The city of Evansville remembered him. His fellow firefighters remembered him. His daughter remembered him, even as his voice grew quieter in her memory with each passing year. And the courts, slowly, painstakingly, through the long and unglamorous work of justice, ensured that the people who took him from the world would spend the rest of their lives reckoning with what they had done. Story 4. There is a particular kind of cruelty that the world reserves for the most vulnerable among us, those who cannot fight back, who cannot fully comprehend the dangers closing in around them, and who trust because they know nothing else. Vera Jo Ryel was one of those people. She was born in Findlay, Ohio on July 11, 1986, a girl who entered the world already swimming against a current far too powerful for her small frame to resist. She was intellectually disabled and diagnosed with ADHD, conditions that, in a loving and attentive environment, need not define a life, need not close any doors. But for Vera Jo, the environment that surrounded her from her very first years was anything but loving. It was from the beginning a crucible of harm. Vera's cognitive abilities were, by the accounts of those who loved her, roughly equivalent to those of a child between 8 and 12 years old. She struggled with reading and mathematics, but she had found ways to thrive within her limitations. In 2005, she walked across a stage and accepted her high school diploma, a milestone she had earned through specialized classes and the kind of quiet persistence that speaks to a person's character far more than their IQ. She sang along to country music with her whole heart. She competed in Special Olympics events. She went out of her way to make the people around her feel good about themselves. By every measure that actually matters, Vera Jo Ryel was a sweet, gentle, entirely decent human being. She deserved a life that reflected that. She did not get one. The first great betrayal of Vera's life came from the person who should have been her safest harbor, her father. Willard Ryel began physically abusing his daughter when she was 11 years old, committing violations so severe that the law eventually sentenced him to 20 years behind bars. Vera was still a child when that abuse began, still forming her understanding of what it meant to be loved, what it meant to be safe, what adults owed to children. The damage that inflicts on a developing mind and heart is incalculable, and it set in motion a pattern that would follow Vera Jo for the rest of her life. The pattern of trusting those who were destroying her. When her mother, Verna, and stepfather eventually moved away from Findlay, Vera found herself adrift, a young woman with the emotional architecture of a child, alone in a city she had always known. It was around this time, in 2005, that she crossed paths with a 13-year-old boy who lived just a few blocks from her on Center Street. His name was Zachary Brooks. He had cognitive disabilities of his own, and the two of them formed a friendship that, without the guidance of any responsible adult, deepened into something neither of them fully understood. Zachary's mother, Sherry Brooks, noticed the relationship with the cool, calculating attention of a woman who had learned long ago to spot an opportunity. Sherry Lynn Brooks was a figure of enormous, unsettling power in the neighborhood she occupied. Her neighbors and acquaintances described her in terms that would be dramatic if they weren't so thoroughly documented. Manipulative, a compulsive liar, a woman who could pressure people into almost anything, a woman some in Finley had taken to calling the female Charles Manson. She had grown up carrying wounds of her own. Placed in foster care at age 3 after her father abused her, she had lived a life shaped by cycles of trauma she never broke. She had borne 9 children over the years and had lost custody of 5 of them, each removal tied to allegations of sexual abuse and neglect too severe to ignore. The children she retained were raised in a household defined by methamphetamine, poverty, manipulation, and violence, a household where the line between family and captivity was always disturbingly thin. What Sherry wanted from Vera Jo was simple, and it tells you everything you need to know about her. She wanted a baby girl. She had lost a daughter years before, a wound that had never healed, and she had never stopped reaching for a replacement. Vera Jo, young and trusting and desperately in need of somewhere to belong, was the means to that end. Sherry invited her to move into the Brooks home on Center Street with warmth and apparent generosity. Vera Jo, who had no mother nearby and no one else to turn to, accepted. The mask did not take long to slip. Almost immediately after moving in, Vera began to experience what would become 5 years of systematic control and exploitation. Sherry convinced Vera to sign over her monthly Social Security disability checks, the only income Vera had, to herself, declaring herself Vera's guardian and payee. The money was never used for Vera's benefit. Vera began to be denied food regularly, sometimes allowed only to eat the leftovers from other family members' plates when they were done. The beatings started, administered primarily by Sherry and by Zachary, who by now had grown into a young man shaped entirely by his mother's worldview. Vera endured these blows and told police, when they came, that she had fallen down the stairs or bumped into furniture. She had been so thoroughly broken that she could not conceive of telling the truth. In November 2009, Vera gave birth to a daughter. Sherry had already chosen the baby's name, Willadine. She had pressured Zachary into signing custody over to her, and she had determined from the beginning that this child was hers. When nurses at the hospital handed the newborn to Vera, her mother, the person who had carried her, Sherry ordered them to give the baby to her instead. Vera, desperate and afraid, had tried to be a mother to Willadine with every fragment of herself that the Brooks household had not yet destroyed. She loved her baby girl with a depth that transcended her circumstances, that transcended the limitations others placed on her. But Sherry controlled access to Willadine the way she controlled everything else, completely. She threatened to kill the baby if Vera disobeyed. And so Vera stayed, because what else could she do? The warning signs were visible to anyone who chose to look. Between 2009 and 2011, police were called to the Brooks home at least 10 times due to reports of harassment, threats, child abuse, neglect, fighting, and dangerously poor living conditions. On one visit in January 2011, Officer Marcia Hill arrived to find Vera's face bruised and cut, her nose broken. Vera claimed she had been hurt by an ex-boyfriend in Lima. Officer Hill noted the condition of the home, a bathtub black with mold, a mattress placed over rotting food, cockroaches moving across the floors, a pig confined in a closet. A welfare check 3 days later, accompanied by a children's services worker, produced a report describing a smell so overwhelming it hit visitors the moment the door opened. The home had no running water. Residents were using buckets. Despite all of this, despite the broken nose, the filthy conditions, the absence of running water, and the presence of a visibly terrified, intellectually disabled young mother in the care of a woman with a documented history of child abuse, none of it resulted in Vera's removal to safety. She fell through every crack the system had to offer. Vera's sister, Ashley, visited her the day before she died. She found Vera sitting outside the Brooks house. Ashley told her she loved her. Vera said something she had never said before in all the years of Ashley's life. She said it back. I love you too. Ashley would hold those words for the rest of her life, understanding too late that they were a goodbye. In late March 2011, two new arrivals appeared at the Brooks home. 21-year-old Daniel Bixler Jr. and his 17-year-old girlfriend, Nicole Peters. Bixler was Sherry's cousin's son, a family entanglement that made a grotesque kind of sense given the household he was entering. He had been released from prison just 3 weeks earlier, serving time for burglary, theft, and receiving stolen property. And before that, a juvenile record including an assault on a 7-year-old child with a baseball bat. He was already in violation of his release conditions. He had nowhere to go. And so he came to the Brooks house, where a woman named Sherry welcomed him with the kind of warmth she extended only to those she believed could be useful. By this point, Sherry had lost whatever thin thread of interest she had maintained in Vera. Willadine was growing up, no longer a helpless infant Sherry could possess entirely. Sherry wanted another baby girl. She wanted Vera gone. The method she had in mind was one she presented almost as a dark joke. She suggested to those around her that Vera could be drugged with sleeping pills and placed on the nearby train tracks. The train would do the rest, and no one would be the wiser. She also began spreading a lie. She told Zachary, Danny, and others that it had been Vera who pushed Sherry's son Kevin Jr. in front of the car that had killed him the previous August. Kevin Jr.'s death had devastated the household in its own chaotic way, giving his family a target for that grief, and making that target Vera, was the kind of manipulation Sherry did effortlessly. What followed was 3 days of escalating, organized cruelty. On March 24, 2011, Zachary beat Vera severely and assaulted her with a toothbrush. By the next day, she was so badly injured she could barely walk. Danny and Nicole pulled her into the bathroom and stabbed her in the leg. Nicole, who investigators and witnesses described as someone who found violence intoxicating, pressed her fingers into Vera's wounds. On the same day, younger members of the Brooks household, including 14-year-old Chucky, forced Vera to eat from the garbage. Vera endured all of it in the only way she had ever known how. She endured. On the evening of March 26th, the final phase began. Danny, Nicole, Zachary, and others took turns with a knife. In the confusion of testimony and conflicting accounts that followed, the precise sequence of events in the house that night was difficult to reconstruct entirely. But the destination was never in doubt. When Danny and Nicole told Vera it was time to take a walk, she was terrified. She asked Scotty, the teenage boy who was Sherry's son, to come with them. Scotty went to get his shoes, but Zachary blocked him, and when Scotty returned, Vera was already being pushed out the door. She looked back at Sherry Brooks as she crossed the threshold into the cold Ohio night, and in those last moments before the door closed behind her, she said the only farewell available to her, the name she had used for this woman who had imprisoned her and stolen her daughter and now orchestrated her death. Good night, sugar babe. The train tracks ran near the Blanchard River, not far from Center Street, close enough to walk to in the dark. Danny and Nicole led Vera there, through the night air that smelled of early spring and river water and the last remnants of an Ohio winter that had not yet entirely let go. At the tracks, they began stabbing her. They stabbed her until the knife was too dull to cut through her clothing, and then they ordered her to remove her clothes. They stabbed her again, in her legs, her pelvis, her chest, her throat. Vera Jo Ryel, who had come into the world as a gentle and trusting soul, who had spent 24 years absorbing the worst that could be directed at a human being, fought back with everything she had left. She cried. She told them she could not breathe. When she finally stopped moving, Daniel Bixler and Nicole Peters laid her sideways across the tracks and walked away. When they returned to the Brooks home that night, Daniel made a statement to those present that was stripped of any humanity. He announced what he had done as though it were an accomplishment. The household went quiet. Some slept. The night outside continued. And on those tracks, in the cold and the dark, Vera Jo Ryel lay dying. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on March 27, 2011, a train operator approached the section of track near the Blanchard River. He saw something lying across the rails and assumed it was a deer. He applied his brakes, but not in time. When the train finally stopped, he stepped out and understood that what he had struck was not a deer, but a person, a young woman, lying naked in the cold. He called the police, and within hours, officers arrived at the scene. One of them recognized her. Vera Jo Ryel. She lived 2 blocks away on Center Street. Investigators moved quickly. The initial theory, that Vera might have been struck accidentally by the train, was dismissed almost immediately. Dr. Mark Fox, who performed the autopsy, determined that the wounds were not consistent with a train impact. She had suffered blunt force and sharp force trauma across her torso, head, and legs, and the attack had taken place at the tracks themselves. This was a murder scene. The question was who had brought her here. When police arrived at the Brooks home on Center Street, Sherry greeted them with a story she had already prepared. Vera had left the previous night with a new boyfriend, she said. A black man from a nearby town, she added. A detail deployed with the particular ugliness of someone hoping prejudice will do the work that evidence cannot. But the story fell apart quickly. A search of the home produced Nicole's bloody shirt, a belt, and a lock of Vera Jo's hair. Within a day, police had Daniel Bixler Jr. and Nicole Peters in custody. Under questioning, both confessed to the killing, and both pointed at Sherry as the person who had ordered and directed it. The investigation widened. Evidence emerged about the full scope of what had been happening in the Brooks household for years. The disability checks extracted from Vera, the systematic beatings, the welfare checks that had seen and reported nothing of consequence, the 10 police calls that had produced no protection. The community of Findlay reacted with grief and fury and a deep, uncomfortable reckoning. The systems built to protect someone like Vera Jo Ryel, school systems, social services, healthcare providers, law enforcement, had all encountered her and retreated. She had been failed at every gate. The charges that followed were numerous. Daniel Bixler Jr. initially attempted an insanity plea, but was evaluated and found competent to stand trial. He ultimately changed his plea to guilty, admitting in a voice that witnesses described as utterly without remorse or emotion that he went to the tracks with Vera Jo and ended up stabbing her. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 40 years. Nicole Peters also pleaded guilty, confirming in her court appearance that the murder had been planned, that Zachary had supplied the weapon, and that members of the Brooks family had been present for the beating that preceded it. She was sentenced to 23 years, the maximum her charges allowed. At sentencing, she offered an apology that Vera's mother, Verna, received with bitter clarity. She said it was performed for the benefit of the judge, not from the heart. Zachary Brooks, the father of Vera's daughter, the young man whose mother had engineered everything, received 4 years for obstruction of justice. Michael and Shannon Brooks received lesser sentences for obstruction. 14-year-old Chucky was charged as well. Sherry Brooks, the woman who had conceived the scheme, controlled the household, collected Vera's disability checks, and reportedly given the order that ended in murder, pleaded guilty only to obstruction of justice. She walked out of that courtroom. She would later spend 40 months in federal prison, but on drug trafficking charges, not for what was done to Vera Jo. For Vera's family, and for the community of Findlay, the sentences closed nothing. They answered the legal question of who had done this thing, and they distributed consequences with the uneven hand of a system that had already failed Vera many times over. But they could not address the deeper question that lingered in every room. How does a society allow this to happen? How does a vulnerable young woman, already known to police and social services, end up trapped for 5 years in a house of horrors while the mechanisms designed to find her simply look away? And then there was Willadine. Vera's daughter was removed from the Brooks home in the days following her mother's murder and placed in foster care. Sherry made an attempt to assert custody. Zachary, from behind bars, filed a petition. But during a visit to assess his fitness as a parent, Willadine screamed and refused to go near him. Zachary withdrew. The state revoked his parental rights, and Willadine was adopted by a family. The day after Vera's murder, police found her clothes on the riverbank. Tucked inside her favorite purple hoodie was a piece of paper. Vera Jo Ryel, who struggled with reading and math and the many demands of a world that had never been built with her in mind, had written a letter to her daughter. She seemed to have known what was coming. The letter said, "I love you, Willadine. You are a good little baby girl to us. I am glad to be your mommy, and I am glad that I had you on November 4th at 4:16 a.m., 6 pounds, 2 ounces, 19 inches long. Mommy loves you. After the case was resolved, detectives retrieved that letter from the evidence locker and gave it to Willadian's adoptive family, along with a hope that when the time was right, when Willadian was old enough to understand and to carry it, they would give it to her, so that she would know, so that whatever darkness preceded her life, whatever cruelties shaped her mother's years on this earth, there was one thing in the story of Vera Jo Ryel that no one could ever distort or diminish or take away. Her mother loved her, from the very depths of whatever she had left. Story 5. There are crimes that unsettle a city, and then there are crimes that unsettle something deeper. Something in the human understanding of what a home is supposed to mean, what a family is supposed to be. The story of what happened inside a quiet house on Coldstream Terrace in Tarzana, California, during the first week of November 2023 belongs to that second, darker category. It is a story that began with what appeared, from the outside, to be an ordinary American family, a husband, a wife, her elderly parents, and 3 young children, living together under one roof. And it ended with a homeless man opening a trash bag in an alley 5 miles away and discovering what no person should ever find. Maylee Haskell was 37 years old, and by every account from those who knew her, she was the kind of woman who made a home feel like a home. She had grown up with the quiet strength of someone who had been raised to value family above almost everything else, and that value was evident in the life she had built. She and her husband, Samuel Bond Haskell, had 3 children together, and her parents, her mother Yenxiang Wang, who was 64, and her stepfather Gaoshan Li, who was 71, had moved in to share the family's life at the large house in Tarzana, a comfortable suburban neighborhood on the western edge of the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. The arrangement was not unusual in the context of their family culture. The grandparents were close to the grandchildren, and the household operated as a single, interconnected unit. It was, in every visible sense, a multi-generational home held together by love. Samuel Haskell, the man Maylee had married and built this life with, carried a name that opened doors in Hollywood. His father, Samuel Haskell III, was a well-known and once powerful Hollywood agent, a man who had represented some of the biggest names in American entertainment. Growing up in the shadow of that kind of industry prominence, the younger Sam had absorbed the language of ambition and image, of presenting a curated version of oneself to the world. He was 35 years old in 2023, possessed of an expensive camera he used to pursue work in the film industry, and drawn, acquaintances would later note, to a particular aesthetic in film, slasher narratives, dark subject matter, the kind of content that most people in Hollywood engaged with professionally without it meaning anything personal. But by the autumn of 2023, what Sam was presenting to the world and what was actually happening in his life had quietly drifted very far apart. In the months before November, Sam had been engaged in an affair with a 27-year-old woman. The relationship was not a passing impulse. It was something he had invested in, something around which he had quietly begun to organize a future. In October 2023, he told this woman that his children would soon be living with his parents. The implication was clear. He was making arrangements. He was planning an exit from his existing life. On October 20th, he walked into a Home Depot store and purchased an unusual collection of items: plywood, a canopy, a moisture barrier, coveralls, and diamond saw blades. The receipt was folded into his wallet, and at the time, there was no reason for anyone outside his household to think anything of it. On October 21st, he purchased a one-way airline ticket to Japan. On November 2nd, he asked his lover to accompany him on a trip to Japan, planned to begin November 28th. He had, in other words, built an elaborate and specific plan, and the materials he had purchased from Home Depot were not for home improvement. The last confirmed date on which Maylee Haskell, Yenxiang Wang, and Gaoshan Li were seen alive was November 6, 2023. What happened inside 4100 Coldstream Terrace on that date? Exactly how 3 people died, in what order, over what span of time, because the man who alone knew the answer to those questions ultimately took that knowledge with him. All 3 victims were killed inside the home, and that a blood-stained piece of plywood recovered from the residence matched the kind of surface on which a body might be dismembered. The large saw, machete, and multiple knives found later were consistent with the savage and methodical work that followed. Haskell, her mother, and her stepfather were murdered and dismembered inside the home where they had been living. The home that had also been, until that week, a place where 3 young children played, and where 2 elderly grandparents had grown comfortable in the rhythms of family life. The morning of November 7th, 2023 arrived in Tarzana like any other Los Angeles autumn morning, warm and quiet, the kind of day that gives no sign of what has happened behind closed doors. Sam Haskell stepped out of the house and set about the work of erasing what he had done. He contracted 4-day laborers, workers hired informally for moving and heavy lifting, and put them to work removing large, heavy black plastic trash bags from the house. The bags were sealed, and the workers were given no explanation of their contents. But one of the workers, performing what he thought was ordinary labor, opened one of the bags. What he saw stopped him. He called the police. The call brought investigators to the house, but by the time they arrived to conduct an initial check, the full gravity of what had happened was not yet confirmed. Sam, according to what was pieced together later, had already left and was staying at an Airbnb with his 3 children. An arrangement that, from the outside, might have looked like a father taking his kids on a short trip. He had also, at some point during that day, personally driven to the 16,000 block of Ventura Boulevard in Encino, 5 miles from the Tarzana house, with a large bag. Surveillance cameras installed along that commercial stretch of road captured him. The footage showed him at a dumpster, depositing the bag. On the morning of November 8th, a man looking through that same dumpster in Encino opened the bag. Inside, he found a human torso, headless and horrific in its condition. He dialed 911. Within hours, law enforcement had connected the discovery in the dumpster to the report made by the day laborer the day before, and both trails led to the same address, 4100 Coldstream Terrace, Tarzana. Detectives obtained warrants and returned to the house with the full weight of a homicide investigation behind them. What they found inside transformed the case from a missing persons inquiry into something far darker. 8 plastic bags containing bloody bedding and towels were recovered. A large saw, a machete, multiple knives, a blood-stained plywood board, the kind consistent with the Home Depot receipt found later in Sam's wallet, and canes recovered from inside the house that had belonged to the 2 elderly victims. Mei Li's parents, Yenxiang Wang and Gao Shanli, were nowhere to be found. They have never been found. While investigators worked the scene at the house, other officers moved to locate Samuel Haskell. They found him the same day, November 8th, driving the SUV he had rented 5 days before the murders. When they stopped the vehicle, what they found inside was the portrait of a man who had been preparing to vanish. A loaded .357 caliber revolver was holstered in the vehicle. 32 rounds of live ammunition were present. A military-style knife, encrusted with blood, was recovered. A headlamp, a firearm sight, and 4 passports, 1 for Sam, 1 for Mei Li, and 1 each for their 3 children. In his wallet, alongside the Home Depot receipt, was the one-way ticket to Japan. He was arrested. The forensic work that followed in the weeks and months after the arrest was painstaking and, in its findings, devastating. DNA analysis conducted on the blood found on the military knife recovered from the vehicle produced matches for all 3 victims, Mei Li, Yenxiang Wang, and Gao Shanli. Blood stains found on the firearm matched the genetic profiles of Mei Li and her stepfather, Gao Shanli. In March 2024, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner released findings from the autopsy conducted on the torso recovered from the Encino dumpster, confirming through kinship analysis that it belonged to Mei Li Haskell. The manner of her death, beheaded, her body dismembered, was established in clinical, irrefutable detail. The remains of Yenxiang Wang and Gao Shanli have never been located. In a case already defined by cruelty, this is among its most haunting dimensions. 2 elderly people who had come to America, who had moved in with their daughter and son-in-law to be near their grandchildren, were killed inside that house and their remains disposed of with such thoroughness that the earth has not given them back. Their families have had no grave to visit, no remains to mourn over. They simply ceased to exist in the world of the living, and no burial has followed. Samuel Haskell was formally charged in November 2023 with 3 counts of murder, with the special circumstance of multiple murders attached to the charges. He entered a plea of not guilty. His 3 children, who had been staying at the Airbnb with him at the time of his arrest, were placed in the care of a relative. The house on Coldstream Terrace, which had been full of life just days before, became a crime scene, and then, in the months that followed, simply a silent address on a quiet street. The legal proceedings stretched forward through 2024 and into 2025. Questions arose about the full extent of Sam's premeditation. The Home Depot receipt, dated October 20th, 16 days before the murders, was a particularly damning piece of evidence, suggesting that the purchase of diamond saw blades and a moisture barrier was deliberate preparation for what he had planned to do. The one-way ticket to Japan, purchased the very next day, reinforced the picture of a man who had already decided that his wife, her parents, and the life they shared were obstacles to be removed, after which he would disappear to the other side of the world with his lover. As for the motive, the specific emotional or psychological engine that had driven a man to commit an act of such extremity against his own family, prosecutors were candid that they did not fully know. There was the affair, clearly. There were the plans to leave. There was, perhaps, a financial dimension that the investigation never fully illuminated. There may have been arguments, confrontations, a domestic atmosphere that had been deteriorating for longer than the outside world had perceived. But the exact constellation of grievances, desires, and decisions that had culminated in November 6th inside that house remained locked inside the mind of the man accused of the crime. That man would not face a jury. On July 12, 2025, just 2 days before he was scheduled to appear for his preliminary hearing at the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the proceeding at which prosecutors had been prepared to lay out their full forensic case against him, Samuel Bond Haskell was found dead in his cell at Twin Towers Correctional Facility in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department confirmed the death and classified it as a suicide. He was 37 years old. Los Angeles County District Attorney Nathan Hochman spoke to reporters in the hours after Haskell's death was confirmed, and his words carried the weight of a system robbed of its moment of reckoning. Instead of standing before a judge and jury to answer for what he did, Hochman said, Mr. Haskell chose to take the coward's way out. He added something that resonated with particular force. The full motive for an individual to so violently and barbarically kill 3 people and chop up their bodies. Mr. Haskell has taken that motive to the grave with him. That sentence contains the core tragedy of the case's conclusion. The families of Mei Li, Yanxiang Wang, and Gao Shanli had endured nearly 2 years of waiting. Waiting for proceedings, waiting for hearings, waiting for the day they would sit in a courtroom and watch the man responsible answer, in the most formal and public sense possible, for what he had done. They had been promised a preliminary hearing on July 14, 2025. Instead, they received a notification of death, and with it, the permanent closure of every question they had hoped a trial might answer. The 3 children of Samuel and Mei Li Haskell grew up in that house on Coldstream Terrace. They knew their grandparents, Yanxiang Wang, who had moved in to be near them, and Gao Shanli, whose canes were later recovered by police from the blood-stained interior of the home where he was killed. Those children are now living with a relative, building a life after an event that shattered the one they knew. Their mother has been identified in a medical examiner's report, but cannot be buried whole, because she was not found whole. Their grandparents have not been found at all. The Samuel Haskell case is, in its formal legal sense, closed. No verdict was ever delivered. No sentence was ever announced. No courtroom packed with spectators ever heard a final, definitive accounting of what happened on November 6, 2023. The charges were filed, the evidence was assembled, the DNA was matched, the surveillance footage was catalogued, and then the accused died in a jail cell, and the machinery of justice stopped without finishing its work. What remains is grief without a proper conclusion. A mother who wanted to be near her grandchildren and died in the house where they played. An elderly stepfather who used a cane to walk and whose remains have never been found. A young woman, a wife, a daughter, a mother of 3, whose torso was identified in a clinical report and whose name appears now in court documents that will never produce a verdict. And 3 children who have inherited a silence where answers should be, a question mark where justice was supposed to stand. The house on Coldstream Terrace is just an address now. But what happened inside it, the planning, the violence, the disposal, the flight that never got off the ground, is a story about what can grow in the dark spaces of a family life, invisible to everyone outside until the day it cannot be hidden anymore. By then, for Mei Li Haskell, Yenxiang Wang, and Gaoshan Li, it was already too late. Story 6. The lights of Las Vegas shimmered in the early spring of 2009, casting their artificial glow over the wedding chapels that line the famous strip. Inside a little white wedding chapel, a location known for quickie ceremonies and spontaneous decisions, 28-year-old Jasmine Fiori stood beside a man she had known for exactly 2 days. Ryan Alexander Jenkins, a 32-year-old Canadian who described himself as a real estate investor, had swept into her life with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. On March 18, 2009, they exchanged vows in a ceremony that was as impulsive as it was romantic, binding themselves together in a marriage that would end in unimaginable horror just 5 months later. Jasmine had come to Las Vegas from Santa Cruz, California, bringing with her the kind of striking beauty that opened doors in a city built on image and spectacle. She worked as a swimsuit model and commercial actress, her photographs gracing advertisements and websites, her smile bright and confident. She had recently expanded her professional horizons, obtaining a real estate license and launching a personal training business with a friend. Jasmine was ambitious, driven, building a life for herself in the fast-paced world of modeling and entrepreneurship. Ryan Jenkins had his own carefully constructed image. He told people he was an investment banker worth millions, the kind of wealthy, eligible bachelor that reality television producers dream of casting. That image had landed him a spot on a dating competition show where 17 wealthy men competed for the affections of model Megan Hauserman. Jenkins had made it far in the competition, appearing in every episode as a finalist before his eventual elimination. His smooth demeanor and claims of financial success made him a producer favorite, and he was already slated to appear in another show, I Love Money, scheduled to air in early 2010. But beneath the polished exterior, Ryan Jenkins carried a darkness that would soon reveal itself. He had a criminal history in his hometown of Calgary, Alberta, including a conviction for assault on an unidentified woman that had resulted in 15 months of probation in January 2007. The background check performed the production company behind his reality shows had somehow failed to uncover this troubling history. The whirlwind romance that began in a Las Vegas casino quickly deteriorated into something volatile and frightening. Just weeks after their wedding, in April 2009, Jenkins allegedly struck Jasmine on the arm during an incident at a Las Vegas hotel. The assault was serious enough that in June 2009, Jenkins was formally charged with battery constituting domestic violence in Clark County, Nevada. A trial date was set for December. According to Jasmine's mother, Lisa Lepore, the couple fought frequently. Jenkins was intensely jealous of Jasmine's friendships with her ex-boyfriends, suspicious of her every interaction with other men. The possessiveness that might have initially seemed like passion soon revealed itself as something far more sinister, a need to control and dominate. Jasmine confided to her mother that she had obtained an annulment of the marriage in May 2009, though no court records were ever found to confirm this claim. Whether the annulment was completed or merely discussed, one thing was clear. Jasmine was trying to extricate herself from Ryan Jenkins. Ryan's father, Dan Jenkins, offered a different perspective, claiming that Jasmine would disappear for days at a time and lie about her whereabouts, that she was his son's only friend in California. The conflicting accounts painted a picture of a deeply troubled relationship, two people caught in a toxic dynamic that neither seemed able to escape. By August 2009, Ryan Jenkins was in Mexico, appearing as a contestant in reality show, but even from the show's set, his obsession with Jasmine continued. He called her repeatedly, his need to maintain contact and control transcending the physical distance between them. On Thursday, August 13, 2009, Jasmine and Ryan drove together from Los Angeles to San Diego. They checked into the luxurious hotel, an upscale resort overlooking the Pacific Ocean. That evening, they attended a poker tournament at the nearby Hilton Hotel, joining a group of friends for what should have been an enjoyable night of cards and socializing. But the evening quickly devolved into something uncomfortable and tense. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as awkward, and said the couple had a blowout fight in front of everyone. Jasmine, they said, had been very rude to Ryan, repeatedly putting him down in front of their friends. She had a cutting sense of humor, they explained, and seemed to take pleasure in embarrassing him. Ryan's anger was visible, simmering just beneath the surface, setting a dark tone for the rest of the evening. The group eventually moved from the poker tournament to the Ivy Hotel for drinks. Throughout the night, Jasmine spent an unusual amount of time in the bathroom, talking on her phone. When Ryan confronted her, demanding to know who she was speaking with, she claimed it was her mother. But it was 12:30 in the morning, and the source who witnessed the interaction told ABC News that Jasmine was clearly not talking to her mother. Ryan kept screaming, "Who are you talking to?" his voice rising with frustration and rage. Around 1:30 a.m. on Friday, August 14th, the couple returned to their hotel room to continue their fight, leaving their companions behind. What happened in that hotel room over the next several hours would never be fully known. Sometime between the early morning hours of August 14th and the afternoon, Ryan Jenkins strangled Jasmine Fiori to death that she had been severely beaten, the violence inflicted upon her body both brutal and sustained. Ryan checked out of the hotel alone on Friday morning, his wife's body already lifeless. What Ryan Jenkins did next revealed a calculated attempt to conceal his crime and delay identification of his victim. He obtained a large suitcase and placed Jasmine's body inside it. Then, in an act of horrifying mutilation, he removed all of her teeth and cut off all 10 of her fingers, attempting to eliminate the two most common methods of identifying human remains. He left her nude body stuffed and compressed into the suitcase, the violence of the act evident in the way her body had been badly beaten and crushed. On Saturday morning, August 15th, 2009, a man searching through a dumpster in an alley in Buena Park, California, looking for recyclables, made a gruesome discovery. Inside a blood-stained suitcase was the mutilated body of a woman. Police arrived at approximately 7 a.m. and began processing what they immediately recognized as a homicide scene. The body was so badly damaged and disfigured that visual identification would be impossible. At 8:55 p.m. that same evening, more than 12 hours after Jasmine's body was discovered, Ryan Jenkins called the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to report his wife missing. He claimed he had last seen Jasmine around 8:30 p.m. on August 14th at their penthouse apartment on Edinburgh Avenue in Los Angeles. According to his story, they had returned from San Diego together. She had dropped him off at home that evening, and then left to run errands. She never returned, he said, his voice filled with what police would later describe as manufactured concern. The story was a lie, carefully constructed but ultimately flawed. Jenkins placed himself in Los Angeles at a time when he had actually been in San Diego. He claimed ignorance of Jasmine's whereabouts while her body lay in a suitcase he had placed in that Buena Park dumpster. Meanwhile, investigators in Buena Park faced the challenging task of identifying the victim whose teeth and fingertips had been deliberately removed. But Ryan Jenkins had not anticipated the advancement of forensic science. Medical examiners discovered that the victim had breast implants, and those implants contained serial numbers. By tracing those serial numbers through the manufacturer's records, investigators were able to positively identify the body as Jasmine Fiori. The identification came quickly, and investigators immediately turned their attention to the victim's husband. On Sunday morning, August 16th, at approximately 9 a.m., surveillance footage captured Ryan Jenkins leaving the Edinburgh Avenue penthouse for the last time, carrying luggage and appearing to be in a hurry. He climbed into his black BMW SUV and began driving north, leaving Los Angeles behind. When police contacted Jenkins on August 17th, he claimed he was in Utah and was heading to Canada to resolve some immigration issues. The statement revealed his escape plan, though investigators were not yet ready to formally name him as a suspect. But Jenkins was already putting distance between himself and the crime scene, crossing state lines in a desperate bid for freedom. Jenkins drove north through California and into Washington state, where he picked up his speedboat, a vessel he had named Night Rider. On August 19th, a man matching Jenkins' description was spotted piloting the boat into a marina in Point Roberts, Washington, a small peninsula accessible from the United States by boat, but also reachable overland from Canada. Jenkins' stepmother lived in Point Roberts, and investigators believe he used this connection to facilitate his escape. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police announced they believed Jenkins had crossed into Canada by boat sometime between August 19th and August 20th. On August 20th, 2009, authorities formally charged Ryan Jenkins with murder and issued an arrest warrant. That same day, Jenkins called his detained father at Vancouver International Airport. His father had been stopped at U.S. Customs, and during the brief call before he was forced to hang up due to cell phone restrictions, Ryan likely realized that his family was being monitored and that the authorities were closing in. VH1 made the decision to suspend broadcast of Megan Wants a Millionaire on August 19th, citing respect for Fiori family. The network also canceled plans to air I Love Money 3, where Jenkins had reportedly won the competition. The entire incident effectively ended VH1's celebrity programming block, raising serious questions about the vetting process for reality television contestants. The international manhunt intensified as Canadian authorities distributed Jenkins' photograph throughout British Columbia, warning residents that he was dangerous and possibly armed. "The ring was tightening on him," said Tom Hession, Chief Inspector for the U.S. Marshals Service's Regional Fugitive Task Force. Jenkins was running out of places to hide. On August 21st, a young woman walked into the Thunderbird Motel in Hope, British Columbia, a small town about an hour's drive from the U.S. border. She paid cash for 3 nights accommodation for room number 2 and made small talk with the manager, appearing calm and composed. The manager described her as attractive, about 25 to 30 years old. She stayed in the room with Jenkins for about 20 minutes, then left. That woman was later identified as Elena Jenkins, Ryan's half-sister. The motel manager saw Jenkins walking outside the following day, August 21st. He looked exhausted and was barely recognizable from his television appearances. Jenkins remained holed up in the small, drab room, the reality of his situation settling in around him like the walls of a prison. On Sunday morning, August 23rd, when the couple failed to check out of the Thunderbird Motel as scheduled, the manager and his nephew decided to investigate. They had noticed very little activity over the weekend and were concerned. When they entered room number 2, they found Ryan Jenkins hanging from a clothes rack by a belt. He was 32 years old. There was no suicide note in the room, though investigators later found a document on his laptop titled Last Will and Testament, dated August 20th, 2009. According to Buena Park Police Sergeant Bill Kohanek, the document looked like he was just trying to wrap up some of his thoughts, but he completely left out the homicide out of the verbiage. At a press conference Sunday evening, Buena Park Police Lieutenant Steve Holliday expressed the frustration felt by investigators and Jasmine's family. "The sadness of this all is that Mr. Jenkins will not stand before an Orange County jury for his crimes," Holliday said. "Justice would never be fully served. Jasmine's killer would never answer for his actions in a court of law." On August 27, 2009, investigators discovered a storage unit in Washington state filled with Jenkins' belongings, including a suitcase of clothes. The discovery added another piece to the puzzle of his escape route, though by then, the chase was over. Ryan Jenkins' mother, Nada Jenkins, who resided in Vancouver, refused to accept that her son had killed Jasmine. In a brief interview, she expressed certainty that evidence would eventually prove his innocence, but she broke down crying when describing her son as a good and kind man. Her denial was understandable, the instinct of a mother unable to reconcile the son she knew with the monster who had murdered his wife. The murder of Jasmine Fiori sent shockwaves through the reality television industry and raised serious questions about the responsibility production companies bear when putting contestants on national television. Ryan Jenkins had a documented history of violence against women, yet he had been cast on 2 major network shows and portrayed as an eligible, successful bachelor. The failure to properly vet contestants had deadly consequences. For Jasmine's family and friends, no amount of media attention or industry reform could bring her back. She had been a vibrant young woman with dreams and ambitions, a person trying to build a life and a career. She had recognized the danger in Ryan Jenkins and had tried to leave, seeking an annulment and attempting to create distance. But Jenkins' obsession and rage had proven impossible to escape. The case remains a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic violence and the lethal potential of jealousy and control. Jasmine Fiori died at 28 years old, her life brutally cut short by a man who claimed to love her, but whose love was really possessiveness, whose passion was really violence. Her story, like so many stories of intimate partner violence, ended in a dumpster in an alley, her identity nearly erased by the very person who had promised to cherish her. The glamour of reality television and Las Vegas weddings had masked the darkness that ultimately consumed them both, leaving behind only grief, unanswered questions, and a young woman whose light was extinguished far too soon. Story 7. The city of Melbourne wrapped itself in summer warmth as November 2020 arrived, bringing with it the promise of celebration for the Mano family. Celeste Mano, a vibrant 23-year-old with a radiant smile and an infectious laugh, was just days away from her 24th birthday. Born on November 22, 1996, to Tony Mano and Aggie Di Mauro, Celeste had grown from a happy child into a young woman who loved to dance, cherished her friends, and remained exceptionally close to her extended family. She still let her mother tuck her into bed at night, a tender ritual that spoke to the deep bond they shared. Each evening ended the same way, a kiss, the words, "I love you," and the comfort of knowing they would wake to see each other again. But on the night of November 15, 2020, that familiar routine would become their last. What Celeste and her family didn't fully realize was that danger had been circling them for over a year, growing more obsessive and volatile with each passing day. The threat came from someone Celeste barely knew, a former co-worker named Louis Seiko, a man who had transformed a brief workplace acquaintance into a deadly fixation that would end in unimaginable tragedy. The story began innocently enough in 2019 at a call center where both Celeste and Seiko worked. Celeste was known among her colleagues as warm and empathetic, someone who treated everyone with kindness regardless of their position or circumstances. Seiko, who was 35 years old at the time, had struggled in his role and was eventually fired from the company. As he was being escorted from the building, it was Celeste who walked with him, offering the human decency that the situation required. Before he left, Seiko did something that would later seem deeply unsettling in retrospect. Uninvited, he kissed Celeste on the cheek, thanking her for the kindness and empathy she had shown him during his exit. For most people, that would have been the end of their interaction, a brief moment of courtesy between former colleagues who would likely never see each other again. But for Louis Seiko, that single act of kindness ignited something dangerous within him. He had never been in an intimate relationship with anyone in his 35 years of life. Celeste was the first person toward whom he had ever felt romantic feelings. What should have been a fleeting workplace memory transformed into an all-consuming obsession that would dominate his thoughts and actions for the next 16 months. Just 1 week after being fired, Seiko began what would become a relentless campaign of stalking. He started sending Celeste messages through Instagram, declarations that grew increasingly desperate and disturbing with each passing day. "If it was ever possible, I'd give my life and the world to you," he wrote in one message. "I'm so infatuated with you that it's now becoming unhealthy." The words might have seemed romantic in a different context, but they carried an undercurrent of danger that Celeste immediately recognized. She responded with politeness but firmness, asking Seiko to stop contacting her. When he continued, she asked again, this time more directly. She blocked his Instagram account, hoping that would end the unwanted attention. But Seiko simply created new accounts and continued sending messages, each one revealing the depth of his fixation. The messages arrived at all hours, filling Celeste's phone with declarations she had never invited and didn't want. The young woman who had shown him a moment of kindness was now trapped in a nightmare of his creation. Recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond her control, Celeste did what many stalking victims are advised to do. She went to the police. She provided evidence of Seiko's persistent harassment, the multiple accounts he had created to circumvent her blocks, and the increasingly obsessive tone of his messages. The authorities took her complaint seriously and helped her obtain an interim intervention order, a court-imposed legal mandate that prohibited Seiko from contacting her or approaching her in any way. For a brief moment, it seemed like the intervention order might work. But Seiko was not deterred by the legal consequences. He continued his campaign of harassment, completely disregarding the court's directive. When authorities discovered he had breached the intervention order, he was charged with the violation. Yet even this formal legal action failed to stop him. The restraining order that was supposed to protect Celeste became just another piece of paper that Seiko ignored in his pursuit of a woman who wanted nothing to do with him. Behind the scenes, Seiko was conducting surveillance that went far beyond sending unwanted messages. He had become a digital detective, cross-referencing Celeste's social media posts with Google Maps to determine the exact location of her family home in Melbourne's northeast. He studied the geography of her life, memorizing routes and addresses, preparing for a confrontation that existed only in his distorted imagination. He even went so far as to download a floor plan of the Mano family home, meticulously studying the layout of the house where Celeste lived with her mother. This wasn't casual interest or misguided affection. It was calculated, methodical planning. Throughout this ordeal, Celeste tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy in her life. She continued working, spending time with friends, and nurturing the relationships that mattered most to her. In the months leading up to her 24th birthday, she had begun dating someone new, a relationship that brought genuine happiness into her life after the stress and fear that Seiko's stalking had caused. On the evening of November 15, 2020, feeling content and secure, Celeste posted a photo on her social media account. It was a simple, joyful image of her with her new boyfriend, the kind of picture that millions of people share every day without a second thought. For Louis Seiko, that photograph was a trigger. Seeing Celeste happy with another man sent him into a spiral of jealousy and rage. Justice Jane Dixon would later describe the Instagram photo as the final trigger for an obsessed and jealous man who had been teetering on the edge of violence for months. Whatever fragile control Seiko had maintained over his actions shattered in that moment. He made a decision that would destroy multiple lives. He would go to Celeste's home, and he would kill her. At 3:38 in the morning on November 16, 2020, as Melbourne slept and the stars hung bright above the quiet suburban neighborhood, Louis Seiko drove to the Mano family home. He came prepared with tools of violence, a hammer and a kitchen knife. The house was dark and silent, with Celeste asleep in her bedroom and her mother, Aggie, resting in another part of the home. The peaceful scene was about to be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. Seiko approached Celeste's bedroom window with the hammer clutched in his hand. With brutal force, he smashed through the glass, the sound of breaking echoing through the night air. Inside, Celeste was jolted awake, but she had no time to process what was happening or to defend herself. Seiko climbed through the broken window into her bedroom, the knife now in his hand, and attacked her as she lay in her bed. What happened next lasted only 2.5 minutes, but those 150 seconds would forever change the lives of everyone who loved Celeste Mano. Seiko stabbed her 23 times with the kitchen knife, carrying out the attack with chilling efficiency. The strikes were vicious and unrelenting. One blow pierced her heart, killing her almost instantly. When it was over, Seiko dropped the blood-stained knife on the bedroom floor and climbed back out through the window, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. Minutes later, Aggie D. Morrow entered her daughter's bedroom and discovered a scene that no parent should ever have to witness. Her beloved Celeste, the daughter she had tucked into bed just hours earlier, lay lifeless in a pool of blood. The birthday celebration they had been planning would never happen. The future Celeste should have had, filled with love, laughter, career achievements, and perhaps children of her own, had been stolen in a matter of minutes by a man she had tried desperately to escape. Louis Seiko drove directly to a police station after the murder. Instead of fleeing or attempting to hide his crime, he walked through the doors and made a statement that revealed both his culpability and his complete lack of remorse. "You know what happened, it's your fault," he told the officers. She's dead. Go have a look." He blamed law enforcement for Celeste's murder, claiming that if they had done more to intervene, she would still be alive. He even asked the officers to shoot him, a request they refused. When pressed about the details of what he had done, Seiko claimed his memory of the event was fuzzy, a convenient amnesia that allowed him to avoid taking full responsibility for his actions. The investigation that followed was thorough and damning. Forensic evidence confirmed that Seiko had been the one who smashed through Celeste's window and stabbed her to death. The floor plan of the Mano home found in his possession demonstrated the premeditated nature of his attack. The timeline was clear. Just hours after Celeste posted a photo with her boyfriend, Seiko had executed a plan he had likely been considering for months. He was arrested and charged with murder, and the slow machinery of justice began to turn. For more than 3 years, the Mano family waited for their day in court, living with the unbearable pain of Celeste's absence, while knowing that her killer was alive and would eventually face judgment. A forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Rajan Darji examined Seiko and concluded that at the time of the murder, he had been suffering from an undiagnosed extreme personality disorder, depression, and body dysmorphia. These mental health issues, the psychiatrist suggested, had impaired Seiko's judgment, though he remained capable of knowing the difference between right and wrong. The trial was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The courtroom filled with Celeste's family, mourning not just the young woman they had lost, but also the justice they feared might elude them. Seiko, now 39 years old and wearing a gray prison jumper with black-rimmed glasses, showed no emotion as he sat in the court dock. At one point during the proceedings, he conducted his own cross-examination of the pathologist who had performed Celeste's autopsy, taking issue with prosecutors' characterization that he had run to the murder scene, insisting instead that he had only walked briskly, as if that semantic distinction somehow lessened the horror of what he had done. His body language revealed his agitation, trembling, tapping his hands together, moving his leg up and down. When Aggie Di Maro screamed at him from the gallery, Seiko repeatedly thumped the side of his head with an open palm. Seiko had entered a guilty plea, sparing the family the additional trauma of a full trial, but Justice Dixon noted that he had shown no remorse for his actions. Throughout the proceedings, he attempted to downplay his offending and made what the judge described as spurious and absurd statements to defend his behavior. He refused to accept full responsibility, maintaining the position that others, particularly the police, were somehow to blame for what had happened to Celeste. On February 28, 2024, the day of sentencing finally arrived. The courtroom was packed with supporters of the Mano family, all hoping to hear Justice Jane Dixon pronounce a sentence of life imprisonment, the most severe legal penalty available in the state of Victoria. Celeste deserved life, but you decided otherwise, Justice Dixon told Seiko from the bench. She acknowledged the devastating impact of his offense on Celeste's family and friends, and she confirmed that he had carried out the attack with chilling efficiency, after dropping the knife on the bedroom floor and leaving through the window. But then came the words that would shatter the family's hopes. Instead of life imprisonment, Justice Dixon imposed a 36-year sentence with a non-parole period of 30 years. Seiko, who had already served about 3 years in pre-sentence custody, would be eligible for parole in 2050. The judge explained her reasoning. While Seiko's rehabilitation prospects were limited, there remained a potential that his mental illness could be treated during the decades he would serve before becoming eligible for release. His psychiatric condition at the time of the offense, she said, reduced his moral culpability, and while the crime warranted a very stern sentence, it did not rise to the level requiring life imprisonment. When tears appeared in the courtroom, they were not tears of relief or closure, they were tears of rage and betrayal. Aggie Di Maro, visibly shaking, tore up the first speech she had prepared and delivered the second one instead, a scathing assessment of her daughter's killer and the Victorian justice system. "It's outrageous," she said outside the Supreme Court, her voice thick with emotion and disbelief. "It's unbelievable that the court decided to show him mercy, even when he showed Celeste none. Quite clearly, his right to mercy was more important than her right to life." She went on to express her devastation at a system that would allow a convicted murderer the possibility of parole. "I don't believe in parole. I don't believe in releasing murderers to murder again," she said. The case of Celeste Mano serves as a devastating reminder of the failures that can occur when stalking is not taken seriously enough by the legal system. Despite obtaining an intervention order, despite reporting Seiko to police, despite doing everything she was supposed to do to protect herself, Celeste still lost her life. The system that was meant to safeguard her proved inadequate against the determination of a man consumed by obsession and entitlement. Louis Seiko remains incarcerated, serving his 36-year sentence with the knowledge that he might one day be considered for parole. Justice Dixon noted that the parole board may ultimately determine the risks are too high for him to be granted an early supervised release, but that possibility remains nonetheless. For the Mano family, every day without Celeste is a day too long, and the thought of her killer potentially walking free in 2050 is unbearable. Celeste Mano was just 23 years old when her life was violently stolen from her in the early hours of November 16, 2020. She was days away from her 24th birthday, surrounded by people who loved her, and looking forward to a future that should have been bright and full of possibility. Instead, she became another name in the tragic roll call of stalking victims whose warnings went unheeded and whose protective measures proved insufficient. Her story stands as both a memorial to a vibrant life cut short and a call to action for systemic change, ensuring that the words, "I love you," whispered between a mother and daughter will never again be followed so swiftly by unimaginable loss. Story 8. The morning of March 2nd, 1998, dawned cold and gray over Vienna, the kind of early spring day when winter refused to relinquish its hold on the Austrian capital. 10-year-old Natascha Kampusch stood in her family's apartment in the Donaustadt district, preparing for what should have been an ordinary Monday. She was a small girl with pale skin and light brown hair, just beginning to navigate the independence of walking to school alone. For the past few weeks, her mother Brigitte Cerny had been allowing her to make the short journey to school by herself, a rite of passage that marked the transition from little girl to something approaching autonomy. Natascha pulled on her coat and gathered her school things, unaware that this mundane morning ritual would be the last normal moment of her childhood. As she stepped out into the crisp air and began walking toward her primary school, her mind was likely filled with the typical concerns of a 10-year-old. Homework, friends, the day ahead. The streets of her neighborhood were familiar, safe, the kind of place where bad things happened only on television. But as Natascha walked past a white minibus parked along her route, everything changed in an instant. A man who had been waiting, watching, planning, suddenly moved with the precision. Wolfgang Pricklepil grabbed the small girl and pulled her into the vehicle with practiced efficiency. The door slammed shut, the engine roared to life, and the white minibus disappeared down the Vienna streets, carrying with it a child whose face would soon be plastered across newspapers throughout Austria and beyond. A 12-year-old witness later reported seeing a girl being dragged into a white minibus, though Natascha herself insisted there had been only one man. In those first terrifying moments, bundled in the back of the van, Natascha's mind raced with possibilities. She thought maybe she was going to be raped, then killed. The reality would prove to be something far more enduring and psychologically devastating than a quick death. Pricklepil, a 36-year-old communications technician, drove his captive not to some remote location, but to his own home in Strashof in der Nordbahn, a quiet town less than 20 kilometers from Vienna. The ordinariness of the location would become one of the case's most haunting aspects. Natascha was hidden in plain sight, in a suburban neighborhood where children played and neighbors went about their daily lives, completely unaware that beneath one of their local houses, a child was being held prisoner. When Natascha failed to arrive at school or return home that day, panic spread through her family and the wider community. Brigitte Cerny contacted the police, and a massive investigation was launched immediately. 776 minivans were examined by authorities desperate to find the missing girl. Among those vehicles was the very white minibus that Pricklepil had used to abduct Natascha. Police even questioned Pricklepil himself, going so far as to check his vehicle. He calmly explained that he was alone at home on the morning of the kidnapping, and that he was using the minibus to transport rubble from construction work on his house. The police, finding no reason to doubt him, moved on to other leads. It was a failure that would haunt the investigation for years. The home Pricklepil brought Natascha to was unremarkable from the outside, but beneath its garage lay a secret that he had spent years preparing. He had constructed a windowless, soundproof cellar, a dungeon measuring approximately 5 to 6 square meters, roughly the size of 2 parking spaces placed side by side. The cell was accessed through a steel-reinforced door hidden beneath concrete, designed to be virtually impossible for a child to breach. Inside was a sink, a toilet, and a bare light bulb. Nothing else. The walls were thick concrete. No windows allowed sunlight to penetrate. No sounds from the outside world could reach the interior. This 6-square-meter tomb would be Natasha's entire world for years to come. The early days of captivity were a nightmare of disbelief and terror. Priklapil had warned Natasha that the doors and windows of the house were rigged with high explosives, that any attempt to escape would result in both their deaths and those of the neighbors. He claimed to be carrying a gun and said he would kill her if she tried to flee. In her first years underground, Natasha attempted to make noise, throwing bottles of water against the walls in desperate hope that someone might hear. No one did. The soundproofing was perfect. Priklapil was both captor and the totality of human contact in Natasha's life. He subjected her to brutal physical abuse, beating her when his mood darkened. He starved her, controlling every morsel of food she received, using sustenance as a tool of domination. He shaved her head, stripping away her hair, and with it another piece of her identity. As Natasha grew older and reached puberty at age 14, the nature of the abuse evolved. Priklapil shackled her to him in his bed, subjecting her to what she would later describe as minor sexual assaults. Acts that were less about desire and more about control, possession, and his pathological need for physical closeness. He forced her to share his bed, to be bound to him physically, a grotesque parody of intimacy. But even as he brutalized her, Priklapil also created a twisted domesticity. He forced Natasha to become his domestic slave, making her cook and clean for him. He had installed an intercom system, so he could shout orders into the cellar without having to open the multiple locked doors that separated her prison from the rest of the house. She vacuumed his floors, prepared his meals, maintained his home, all while remaining his prisoner. The psychological torture was perhaps even more damaging than the physical abuse. Priklapil had created a perfect environment in his mind, a fantasy where he would finally have the companionship and control he craved. But reality, as it always does, refused to conform to his delusions. He would fly into violent rages when things did not match his expectations, throwing heavy objects at Natasha, screaming at her for failing to be the perfect captive. Outside the dungeon, the search for Natasha continued for months before gradually losing momentum. Speculation ran wild. Some theorized she had been taken by child pornography rings. Others suggested organ theft. Investigators even looked into possible connections with French serial killer Michel Fourniret. Suspicion fell heavily on Natasha's own family, particularly her mother Brigitta. The media scrutinized Cerny's behavior, some finding her reactions to her daughter's disappearance insufficiently emotional. Years later, conspiracy theorists would accuse her of being complicit in the kidnapping, claims that would result in defamation lawsuits and further trauma for the family. But these were all false trails. The truth was hidden beneath a garage floor in Strashov, where a little girl was slowly transforming into a teenager in captivity. As years passed, Priklapil occasionally allowed Natasha out of the cellar, though always under his strict control and never unsupervised. On rare occasions, he even took her out in public, confident that she was too terrified to attempt escape or attract attention. And he was right for years. Natasha tried unsuccessfully to signal for help when in public, but people paid her no attention. The fear Priklapil had instilled, combined with the psychological bonds that developed between captive and captor, kept her from making more overt attempts at freedom. 3,096 days passed. That was the precise count: 8 years, 2 months, and 21 days of captivity. Natasha had entered the cellar as a 10-year-old child, and was now an 18-year-old woman, though her development had been twisted by isolation and abuse. The world outside had changed. Technology had advanced. Her family had aged. Her mother had never stopped hoping, though hope had become a painful thing to carry. Then came August 23, 2006, the day everything changed. Priklapil ordered Natasha to clean his white van, the very vehicle he had used to abduct her 8 years earlier. It was 12:53 in the afternoon when she began vacuuming the vehicle in the garden. The vacuum cleaner roared loudly, its noise filling the air. Then Priklapil's mobile phone rang. Because of the vacuum's noise, he walked away to take the call, moving out of Natasha's line of sight. And in that moment, Natasha made a decision that would reclaim her life. She left the vacuum cleaner running, its noise providing cover, and she ran. She ran through neighboring gardens, jumping fences with strength born of desperation. She ran down streets, her heart pounding, expecting at any moment to hear Pricklepil behind her or to trigger the explosives he had always warned her about. She called out to bystanders, begging them to call the police, but they ignored her. For approximately 200 meters and 5 agonizing minutes, she ran toward freedom. Finally, she knocked on the window of a 71-year-old neighbor named Inga T. When the woman opened her door, Natasha spoke words she had not been able to say for 3,096 days. "I am Natasha Kampusch." The neighbor called the police, who arrived at 1:04 p.m., just 11 minutes after Natasha's escape had begun. The young woman was taken to the police station in Deutsch-Wagram, where DNA testing would later confirm her identity. The girl who had disappeared at age 10 had returned as an adult, pale from years without sunlight, traumatized but alive. When Pricklepil realized his captive had fled, he knew immediately what it meant. He had told Natasha many times that they would not catch him alive. He had apparently planned all along to end his own life, rather than face capture. He got into his red BMW sports car and drove into Vienna. That night, knowing the police were searching for him, Wolfgang Pricklepil threw himself in front of an oncoming train near the Wien Nord station. He died instantly, taking with him any complete explanation for why he had stolen a child and locked her away for 8 years. The case stunned Austria and captivated the world. For more than 8 years, many had assumed Natasha Kampusch was dead, that her disappearance was just another unsolved murder. Her survival was nothing short of miraculous, and yet the aftermath would prove almost as complicated as her captivity. In the months following her escape, Natasha struggled to adjust to freedom. She could not go out alone, finding public spaces overwhelming and frightening. She kept sunglasses and earplugs with her at all times to shield herself from the bright lights and noise of a world she had been separated from during her formative years. Psychologically, she grappled with complex feelings toward her abuser. "I feel guilty because I brought about his death because of what I did," she told. She even said, "I mourn for him," explaining that had I met him only with hatred, that hatred would have eaten me up and robbed me of the strength I needed to make it through. These statements confused and disturbed many, but they reflected the psychological reality of Stockholm Syndrome and the profound bonds that can form between captives and captors, particularly when the captivity begins in childhood. Natasha would spend years in therapy, living in a modest rented apartment with psychological support to help her navigate her new reality. In a move that shocked many, Natasha eventually purchased Pricklepil's house, the very building that had been her prison. She explained that she did not want it to become a theme park, a morbid tourist attraction. Instead, she owned her past, quite literally, refusing to allow others to profit from or sensationalize her suffering. An investigation completed in 2013 involving American and German experts examined over 9 months of evidence, questioned 113 witnesses, and conducted DNA testing. The conclusion debunked various conspiracy theories and confirmed that Pricklepil had most likely acted alone in the kidnapping. There had been no accomplices, no larger criminal network.